Hello, and welcome to our webinar on the transatlantic expansion, taking a look at what changes, what doesn't, and what breaks for those businesses who want to kind of make the jump across the pond, whether that's UK to US or US to UK. I will kind of kick off with a couple of introductions from Emma, who is our kind of lead expert on this, along with myself. So thank you very much, Emma, for taking the time to join us today. Just want to just give the audience a quick rundown in terms of who you are and your kind of background, please.
Of course. Yep. Hello, everybody. So, thank you, John. So, by way of introduction, I'm Emma, Client Solutions Director at Briars. I've been with the business for 15 years. I've supported hundreds of companies with international expansion, particularly across the UK and the US.
Yeah, brilliant. I'm John Darcy. I'm head of marketing at Briars. So I've been in the marketing space for 13 or 14 years now. Been with Briars for just under kind of 18 months now. Really kind of work closely with Emma in terms of obviously day-to-day dealings with clients and partners. And obviously, this particular topic itself is a real kind of, I would say, popular topic for us. I think it's definitely the one that we would say is the most common route that a lot of kind of businesses look to go on. So again, we'll kind of be diving into the detail today, kind of setting the scene, and obviously hopefully kind of sharing some really good insights and good advice for those who want to kind of make that jump. So that's obviously a little bit of introduction to us. So obviously let's kind of get into in terms of what we will cover today. So just giving a bit of a breakdown in terms of the core kind of points. So obviously we've had a bit of an introduction in terms of from Emma and myself, kind of why transatlantic growth is so popular. Again, there's a number of reasons behind that, and imagine if you're kind of joining us today, you'll probably know a couple of those points, but hopefully there'll be a few there that you kind of don't recognize, or we're kind of diving into detail that you've not heard before. We're also going to have a little look at kind of what stays the same. I think obviously this particular webinar is kind of real focus, or the kind of meat within it is around what changes, but I think a lot of it is looking at what stays the same, and I think there's nuances within that, so we'll dive into that. Like I said, the big chunk in terms of what changes, the kind of not the scary part, of the one that can tend to worry people in terms of what breaks, and then a little bit of kind of practical advice in terms of how to enter the market, a couple of kind of case studies, and a bit of a key takeaways, and then we'll be kind of rounding up with a couple of Q&As that we've been kind of the most popular things that we tend to get asked. So that's a little bit of a rundown in terms of what we were discussing. So let's dive into it. So in terms of why it's so popular, I think, as you can see there, a number of different reasons across the board. I think, the big one that kind of always tends to be, particularly with the shared language and shared mindset, I think culturally, the UK to US, US to UK, albeit there's obviously nuances, but it tends to be probably, I would say, the most popular reason. I think, almost being backed up by that kind of significant economic kind of stability. I think, the US is effectively, and again, everyone has kind of different opinions on it, but I think, you'd be hard to argue it is one of the, if not the kind of most powerful and most important economic markets across the world. And I think that US UK relationship, which has been going on for, I'll probably say decades now, is a significant part of why businesses tend to kind of go down that route with the, there's favorable trade tariffs. Again, obviously tying into a number of other things. I think diving into a couple of the other points, and again, this is something I would probably say where we come into it a lot is around that high value talent and easy mobility. Again, there's significant world-class tech. You look at the standard of universities, both in the UK, whether it be Oxford, Cambridge, and a couple of those kind of red brick universities, as they're kind of called over in the UK, and then you kind of dive across to the US, and you look at again, it's a huge significant talent pond there. You've got powerhouses and probably I would say best in class universities across the US that is probably looked at across the wider world. And I think as you see with the amount of startups and significant kind of businesses and kind of global powerhouses, a lot of them have come from the US and kind of US talents. That always seems to be the one that a lot of businesses tend to look at as an obvious kind of starting point, just purely because the training they've got, the knowledge they've got, and I think that's a big thing that we always tend to get asked about a lot. Is obviously again, and we can kind of dive into a little bit later, but I know obviously Emma's probably got a stronger background than kind of myself in it, but that world class talent tends to be a significant one.
Yeah.
And again, kind of touching on without kind of going into some of the other points, but that easy to operate and easy to trust. And again, there is some kind of nuances around that in terms of it can seem complex in the same way it can seem sometimes, well, that's quite easy to do. I'll just pick up what I do in the US, do in the UK, and vice versa. So that there is some kind of contradictions to that, but ultimately, it's a lot more predictable. It's a lot more structured. There's much more clearer regulations, so that kind of ease and confidence straight off the bat is a big one. And then again, as you kind of dive into some of the other ones, the business friendly structures, the pro growth policies, again, all kind of power towards that international mobility and expansion. So as a real kind of brief overview, they're probably some of the most significant ones that I would say power the reason why it's so popular. Anything else you'd like to add there, Emma?
No, I mean, I would really echo what you were just saying. We're dealing with two of the most powerful economies in the world. There's huge sort of consumer demand, strong investment, access to, like you said, John, like some of the best talent globally. The UK opens the doors to the Middle East, which and across Europe as well. They both have this sort of real kind of business friendly structure which supports clients internationally, to be able to expand into both. And so I suppose on the surface, it looks like a really, really easy move, but there are in so many ways, there's this kind of like false sense of simplicity, which is probably where businesses really do get caught out, which I know we're going to go through in lots more detail. But no, I think you've definitely certainly picked out the highlights.
Brilliant. And then again, just in terms of the probably the final scene set, and I would say before we obviously dive into the detail, obviously look to pick kind of Emma's brains and kind of draw on her expertise. So I think at a real snapshot there, some of those figures and numbers, which from significant kind of stats and figures, just why that kind of the strength of the UK US business corridor remains the most active and will continue to be. The amount of investment between the UK and US economies, I think, was it back end of or kind of Q3 last year, I think, with coincided with the visit from Trump into the UK. There was I think it was 150 billion tech investment, obviously the amount of jobs between the US and UK, that kind of trade dealings, and again, even from a personal standpoint for kind of buyers, that is still continues to be our kind of most common route for a lot of people. Again, it's probably the one that I would say is the most asked about, but also the one that people kind of like to dip the toe into. So again, set the scene hopefully there, and I think so we'll kind of dive into the detail now.
Yeah, I think just sort of flipping back onto that, John, when you just looking at those stats, they're over sort of $1 trillion of investment between those two markets, 300 billion in annual trade. That's for most UK new businesses, this is literally is the number one in terms of international expansion routes, and it's a very well trodden path as well, isn't it? So.
Yeah, and I would kind of echo and kind of jump in on that as well. I mean, obviously you see those figures, and sometimes as we probably got the beauty of working with anything from your kind of startups, scale ups, SMEs, all the way to kind of your big corps. And obviously, when I think a lot of people see these types of figures, it can be like, oh great, obviously the opportunity there, which is great, but it doesn't matter kind of whatever size there is a slice of the pie kind of out there, and I think don't almost be, I would say, overwhelmed by there's a lot out there, it's a bit too much, how do we do it? Actually, regardless of size or space or sector, there will be a niche within the market, albeit there's a lot of prep work that needs to be doing and kind of entering the right way, but again, so much kind of opportunity out there. So
yeah.
So then, I mean, obviously from, as we kind of mentioned at the start, and obviously you've been in kind of the space of global expansion for the past kind of 15 years. I would imagine you probably get on a daily, if not hourly basis in terms of you're speaking to clients and to partners. So just want to kind of give us a bit of a breakdown in terms, obviously the main reason why a lot of businesses tend to kind of, have this as the most popular route is because it feels, I would say, the least risk averse, if he is the most comfortable. Do you want to just kind of give us a little bit of an overview in terms of obviously your own experience, picking out a couple of points here in terms of what almost stays the same when you're looking to make that journey?
Yeah, of course. And I think this is probably the most important mindset shift, probably. Essentially, the core business of the company doesn't need to change, whether expand to the UK or to the US. The value proposition still resonates. There's nothing that needs to change in that sense. And in terms of that sort of ideal customer, fundamentally that also stays the same. A SaaS buyer in London is not completely different to one in New York, for example. The product market fit is still, the biggest asset. So successful expansion really is about just reinventing exactly what you've been doing already in your home country. So it's about replicating what already works. I think the big key message here is that it's yes, you can replicate it, but it has to be done with the right local adjustments. So has to have you have to sort of map out exactly where you're going, what you're doing, and why you're doing it there. It doesn't fundamentally change. It's just about understanding what is needed from a compliance perspective, what the customers look like, what the customers need, and also, as we'll talk about it much later, about the compliance and the regulations and the necessities in those particular states. So yeah, we'll come on to that. But essentially, the core business doesn't need to change, and that can stay the same. It's just understanding what that market looks like, understanding what the clients, what their needs are, what they're wanting from you. Yeah, I think that's the important message, isn't it?
Yeah, no, that definitely. I think as the stuff we kind of touched on earlier, that there's that kind of fine balance between kind of not being, I would say, gung ho and a little bit naive of what works in the UK, works in the US, and vice
Exactly.
versa. But then in the same way, still understanding there's complexities around. And I think as we, you said there, we'll get into the kind of the big one is those kind of state by state compliance. And I would say even from a culture perspective, again, what we probably tend to see is, I would say, a lot of UK businesses tend to go East Coast first rather than West Coast. I think there's
Yeah,
probably a
fine.
couple of reasons for that in terms of, I think the time difference is kind of one. It's obviously, there's a bit of a
Huge, yeah.
difference, but it's not as kind of extensive as the West Coast. And I would say culturally as well, I would say the East Coast is much more aligned than probably what the West
Much more
Coast is.
aligned.
So yes, there's still, say, as you said, fundamental things that stay the same, but some really good points there in terms of almost don't be too worried that just because you want to go to a new location, there is still kind of almost the foundations and the groundwork there, albeit you've probably got to slightly tweak them a little bit. So yeah, some really kind of good points there, Emma. Now on to the kind of I would say the probably the core chunk of what we be speaking about really. So what changes? So I think this is the big difference is that kind of we see. So I would say, number one is definitely that state versus national complexity. Obviously, US, 50 states, very different if you go across the board compared to obviously UK, which is almost probably seen as one set of rules across the country. Do you just want to
That's
give a
it.
bit of a flavour there? And obviously, bit of an overview of it, but also as well, kind of, what type of conversations do you have on a day-to-day basis with people?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is one of the biggest differences, really. As you said, as you said there, John. UK is one market, the US is 50 plus. And it's really understanding what each state has in terms of its own tax rules, in terms of employment laws, payroll requirements. We've got lots of clients that expand from the UK to the US, and they think that actually, hiring people in sort of 5, 6 different states, it's exactly the same, especially when you look at just employment and payroll requirements. But it's not. You have to register in each of those states or the majority of those states you're entering into, which comes with additional costs, complexities, different regulations. It's really about understanding what is required in that particular state, and then you get into the tax side of things. State taxes very different from state to state. So it's not an easy move, and it's always about understanding what that looks like, understanding what those costs are as well, because suddenly you're just ramping up. I think a lot of our clients, we find that they may that they're looking to enter into the US in a particular state because they've identified talent there. So they're led by that because they want to hire these people. But actually, when you then start to strip back, what those costs look like, what the complexities are, what the timeframes then are involved in terms of being able to register and get yourself set up in each of those states. It's so different from the UK. And it just comes back to that point of every state's got different rules and regulations, and it's really about understanding that. We see it time and time again.
Yeah, and I would kind of echo that. I mean, obviously, you've been in this space a lot longer than I have, but I think, when I kind of joined Briars, you may think initially of, business want to expand to the US, and it's kind of not quite a one size fits all, but there'll be quirks, but generally it's that everyone kind of falls in the same umbrella. And I think kind of the way I've probably approached it, I would say kind of advice to businesses is almost see these different, probably say states as individual countries.
Oh,
Like,
definitely.
same way the UK is. I think, even through my lens, and don't get me wrong, I've kind of got it wrong in conversations, but even the difference between California, the difference to New York, the difference to Texas, it's so multi-layered. And I think almost that kind of advice and prep beforehand is, don't just go into it thinking, right, I want to go expand to the US. I really like New York, and that's what I'm going to do. You need a level of preparation and research before that happens. Obviously, you need the right partners and whatnot. But again, that level of research before you even kind of start is a key one. Whereas I
Yeah.
think, when you're coming into the UK on the surface, as you said, then I mean it's kind
Yeah.
of one set of rules. But I
That's it.
think the flip side is there's a bit of a mindset change, because again, it's from a individual state to then to kind of one state. That's a little bit of a quirk to kind of get your head round to, isn't it?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And I know we've got a couple of slides on this separately, but completely different mindset, especially when it comes down to that kind of the employment piece. It's so different in the UK compared to the US. But, I think from certainly that kind of the structural piece and that, entering into the US, completely different to what it looks like in the UK. UK, you've got one when it comes to taxes, it's the same no matter whereabouts in the UK you set up. Same from a compliance perspective in terms of accounting requirements, payroll requirements, and HR side of things as well. But yeah, I think most businesses underestimate this, especially when it comes to that kind of compliance and operational setup.
Yeah, no, definitely, yeah. And I think that's probably, I would say, where we probably get the most I would say inquiries, or the most kind of ask for support really is around this, just because it can be so complex. But I think the big message that we always say to people is, on the surface it may seem, but with the right support, the right level of research, and almost again having a clear idea yourself, it's actually not as bad as you kind of initially seem. So yeah, I think that's always the big one. I think is obviously the biggest change across them all.
Yeah, I think so.
So what does it look like from a hiring and employment reality? Obviously, very, very different across, legislation and regulations. We've got Phil Anderson, who's our global HR director. He kind of works and supports clients with this on a, again, on a daily basis. But again, just wanted to kind of run through what some of the differences are between the way the kind of US works and the way the UK works from a people perspective.
Yeah, of course. So I suppose even though the roles might look the same, the rules are completely different. So in the US, employment is much more flexible. You can hire quickly, exit quickly. Candidates expect speed, strong compensation packages. In the UK, it's like completely different in terms of a structured perspective. So much more sort of employee protections, so longer notice periods, very much more process driven. When you think about hiring in the UK, that can take months to really onboard an employee. They may have notice periods that can be sort of 3 to 6 months, depending on the sort of level of seniority. So the hiring strategy really does need to adapt. And I think we've seen it quite a lot with US clients coming into the UK, that actually they can't quite get their head around the fact that there are so many rules around that employment pace. And they have to adapt their approach. If you identify talent in the UK, you can't suddenly think they're going to go and come on board in the next couple of weeks. Is what they're generally what they would expect it to be. Very, very different.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things where I always probably stuck out to me fairly early on. Obviously, when we working with the teams in terms of producing content from a marketing standpoint, is around that kind of the exit quickly was a big one. I think, when you watch kind of a lot of, US films and you see someone affected, you go, oh, they've been, sacked or fired or whatnot, and they basically put their stuff in the cardboard box and they've gone straight away. And it's like, oh, that's a
Yeah,
bit
yeah, that's
strange.
right.
You don't expect that a little bit, but obviously in the UK, not quite the same. I think, the one in the US that always kind of pops up for me, that took me a little bit of time in terms of figuring out what it was you used to always see 401k, and I was like, does that mean they're getting paid 401,000? And it's not. It's
Yes,
related
yeah.
to the healthcare, isn't it? But that is obviously, again, the US UK healthcare is a big difference. But I say that's a real one, particularly if you're looking to hire in the US, is around that in terms of what you offer, what you've got. Obviously, UK, it's the NHS, which is free. But again, there's obviously some medical provisions there as well. So that they were two of the big ones that always stuck out in the US for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, what comes with that is cost. So, if you're looking to hire in the US compared to the UK, naturally salaries are anyway higher in the
Yeah.
US than they are in the UK. But then, of course, you've got all the benefits on top of it as well. As opposed to UK, the benefits aren't all sort of mandatory. So it's more for culture. It's more about that sort of sector, what they would be expected to be offered,
Yeah.
rather than mandatory.
Yeah, and I think just probably to finish up on this, I think again, because we're kind of relatively close to, but I think in the UK, for example, one of the big, probably I say, talking points or kind of education pieces we've had to do over the last, I would say, 12 months with new businesses from the US looking to come into the UK is around the Employment Rights Act. So this was kind of a bill that's kind of going through government or has effectively been kind of signed off and approved. That's going to bring a number of kind of sweeping changes in terms of how people employ and kind of how they manage their people. Within that, there are so many different things. But I think, again, from a US perspective, coming into the UK, I would say that's, in terms of a piece of advice, that's probably a big one that you need to start kind of having a look into. We've done a lot of content around, and obviously I'm kind of trying to give it from my side of perspective. Obviously, you deal with, businesses every day, Emma, in terms of, do you want to get on? Do you want to do it? I'm kind of coming off from a place of, we do a lot of content that tries to educate the audience before we get there. And I'd say that's definitely been the big, and I'd say even for UK businesses as well, just in the UK, it is a big thing that at the moment, because there's so much stuff involved in terms of how businesses act, how they employ, how they hire, how they manage. So yeah, if I kind of give a piece of advice, I'd definitely kind of have a little look into that one.
Yeah, I'll completely agree. And I think this sort of feeds quite nicely into sort of the next one, which is more culture and behaviour. Because I think this is also one of the most sort of underestimated areas. Speaking the same language, yes, which is great, but the mindset is so, so different. And I think it's really important to sort of pick out on this because, I think from a US perspective, it's very different state to state. As you said a minute ago, John, the East Coast, the West Coast, very different in terms of businesses, in terms of the people, in terms of culture, etc. But generally, the clients that we feel that we work with in the US, they tend to sort of move. They're more direct. They want to move quicker. They sort of respond to vision, ROI much more than the UK. Whereas I find that UK is very much more. They take their time. They want sort of proof. They want case studies. They're sort of built more on trust. It's a slightly different mindset. And I know it's not one rule for one, but everybody is slightly different. But I think if you're sort of generalizing it, that tends to be how we sort of see it. So probably from that sort of sales approach and the messaging, it's very much understanding how the teams operate, needing to adjust, and of course when you're then looking to hire people in either the UK or the US outside home country, you have to then adapt yourself to ensure that you're sort of being more inclusive to those employees also, in the US or the UK, to make sure that they understand how you want them to work and you understand how they work themselves.
Yeah, I think that the culture kind of out of everything. This is nothing against the compliance stuff, but that tends to be a little bit more. I would say boring. Boring's the wrong word, but a little more kind of the rules and whatnot. But the culture side of things always fascinates me because it is. There's so many different kind of little quirks and whatnot. Obviously, you've heard kind of some of the expansion stories where big brands go over to not just the US, the UK, but to different locations and different regions, and there's almost horror stories a little bit. And it always kind of
Yeah,
fascinates me
right.
about how you change what you do here, and kind of do it over into another location. I think your point there in terms of how much it changes state to state again is a big one. It feels like it's almost a repetition of the point. But I was on a call with one of our team over in the US, our kind of HR expert, and she was talking about the difference in terms of even work attire for someone in California to someone in New York. And
That's it.
again, very sweeping kind of generalizations, but they were kind of come in the office in flip flops. And again, I'm not saying everyone's like that, but again, that was just one of the examples she referred to. Whereas in New York, it's quite suits and boots and quite polished in that side of things. But I even think in terms of the mindset, I think the US is, I would say, a lot more entrepreneurial, a lot more, they have a real positive outlook at it. And I think the UK is, albeit they have it, and there's a lot more kind of really driven entrepreneurs, is there's definitely a cautiousness there and almost a slight kind of overthinking. And again, you are kind of generalizing there, but it does happen in terms of the day-to-day dealings. I think we had an event last week, didn't we, Emma, where we had a couple of speakers who manage kind of global teams, in particular the UK and the US, and they were just speaking about some of the little nuances in terms of, they've got some really good experience from a global workforce management perspective
Yeah.
and managing different teams in from LATAM to Europe to APAC. But again, when they kind of touch on some of the US and UK, just in terms of how they manage a sales team, the sales process as well, such a kind of a small overlooked thing, but how long that sales process takes from start to finish in the US is significantly different to the UK. But on the
Yeah.
surface, that's not something you would think about.
No, no, completely agree. Completely agree. And it is all about that integration piece, isn't it? It's really understanding it and having that, ensuring that you're open and willing to integrate the two together. Um, yeah,
Yeah, and I think not again to kind of finish up on this one again, not kind of being, I would say, probably scared to kind of learn or ask a little bit. Obviously, in the right scenarios, a little bit. I think if you go into this with the mindset of we're all, they're the ones who tend to kind of come unstuck a little bit. And we've had a few people come to us and saying, I've ended up in this kind of pickle. How can you kind of help me sort it a little bit? So ideally, you don't want to get there, but it does happen.
definitely. And I think from experience here, we probably see, if I'm honest, more US companies coming into the UK, hiring into the UK, and not understand the UK piece more than the other way around. And they're the
Okay.
ones we tend to have to sort of unpick a little bit more because of because I suppose how strict we are in the
Okay.
UK and how many sort of rules and regulations there are. And not understanding that culture piece and what they're expecting, what the employees are expecting, is probably, it's more that way round, probably than having to unpick the UK going into the US.
Okay,
Um,
that's really interesting. Actually, I mean, again, that's probably one of the first times I've kind of heard that of like what would be almost like which side gets it wrong
Guess,
more a
yeah,
little bit, and
yeah,
I bet it'd be kind of again elements of that type of mindset of what let's just kind of dive in. But I think that UK approach of I'd probably say slightly more risk averse may help them a little bit because they probably go in with their eyes wide open a little bit more. But really kind of interesting to kind of to hear what that is. I think you've slightly touched on a little bit there in terms of reality and market dynamics, but again, the big thing is cost.
yeah,
Just want to kind of give us an idea, it'd be good to kind of hear a little bit in terms of examples or what are the big costs that tend to surprise people. I think, we're probably guilty, I would say, or, yourself, Emma, not to kind of put you in a spot in terms of you've been doing this for, 15 years or so. But I'd imagine when people first want to do it, the cost element around it, it can be significantly different even by state. But I think, just kind of set the scene a little bit, kind of dive in and just
yeah.
explain a little bit more what that is.
Yeah, of course. And I think this is actually where the sort of expectations don't actually then match at all. We've talked about shared language, we've talked about lots of other reasons why the UK and the US are actually quite similar, but actually this is where it is completely, completely different. The US is very much a much more expensive market. So not just salaries, and that's across the board. It's, not necessarily senior salary, it's salary level. It's, across the board, they are just generally higher. But healthcare benefits, state taxes, it's all a lot more expensive than it is in the UK. UK is much more sort of predictable, lower cost, and much sort of typically slower in terms of growth, in terms of sort of, increasing the salary as well. If you think about sort of salaries alone, particularly states like New York, San Francisco, even Austin now, they tend to have that sort of slightly higher base salaries. And then when you're looking at that sort of healthcare and benefits on top of it, insurances, generally you can add on sort of 20 to 30% on top of the salary, which is quite significant. We are
Yeah.
already at a higher salary than in the UK as well. And then in addition to that, we've got sort of state level taxes and compliance costs, which then vary dependent on whereabouts and what state they're in. So it's generally all round a much sort of more expensive way to do business and hire people, etc. But at the same time, you've got, wonderful talent there, and often we see companies that are hiring these people in the US because they've identified that they are the right person for that role, the right person to drive their business forward. So if they've done the research, they've understood exactly what they're going to be paying for it, then they're quite comfortable with it. But it's just something to sort of be warned that it's not the same as it is in the UK
Yeah.
at all.
And there's almost that opportunity cost, isn't it? But then, I mean, with any sort of expansion, kind of story in terms of where it started, there is a cost element to it, and that depends whether you're looking to hire one worker, set up an office, set up multiple offices, whatever you're looking to do, plant and whatever. There is obviously a cost. The flip side of that is, the reason, particularly I would say the UK to US, the reason why it's so appealing is almost that, without kind of being cheesed, that kind of American dream, the land of opportunity and whatnot. The reason why it continues to be the most, probably I would say, economic powerhouse on the planet is purely because the opportunities there. You know what I mean? The people, the commercial aspects of it. So yes, it may need an investment or a cost to start with, but I would definitely look at it as an investment to then turn it into something
Oh,
that's kind of higher beneficial. I think that's sometimes where we probably help people on that kind of journey again, in terms of they'll come and have the initial conversation. There's probably a little bit of research and, I would say, nervousness because they see the initial cost come up. But when you actually look at it for kind of an outlay to start with of what that then generates moving forward, it is a bit of a no-brainer. So I would
oh,
definitely look at it
completely.
in that mindset.
Yeah, I completely agree. So I think, in terms of, yeah, it is a much higher cost in general, but at the same time, the US is a faster moving market. So, as deals can happen quicker, buyers can, or clients can sort of be more open to sort of solutions, revenue can scale faster, all of that sort of stuff. But it is a higher cost, and, but then there's high reward. So, it's a give or take.
Definitely. And then, obviously, in terms of they're the big things of what changes, but then without being kind of, we'll probably touch on a couple of these, but I kind of bringing the audience kind of down a little bit. But what are the key things that tend to kind of break when people are doing that transatlantic expansion, kind of both sides of it?
Yeah, of course. So I suppose the first thing we see in businesses is, trying to copy and paste their home market approach into a new market. So I suppose the same messaging, the same sort of sales process, same expectations, and it just doesn't sort of land as such. Um, I suppose that sort of it's usually because of those subtle differences in buyer behavior, communication style, sort of decision making pace, for example. Um, that sort of second biggest issue, I suppose, is that first hire. So, that is absolutely critical to business. Getting that first person right in a new market sets that tone, sort of builds that sort of early relationships, often shapes that kind of brand locally, I suppose. But when that hire goes wrong, whether it's the wrong profile or the wrong experience or the wrong culture fit, that can really set back a few months. So having that sort of first hire strategy is really, really important. Um, that sort of third area, which is that cost underestimation. I suppose businesses go in expecting one thing and then very quickly realise that actually hiring is more expensive. So that goes back to sort of a little bit to what we were just talking about.
Yeah,
But also running the operation is more complex. There's in some ways the UK seems like it's more straightforward, but actually there's some states in the US which actually it's really easy as well. And I think understanding what those operational costs look like, and operational sort of delivery is really, really important. And that if you get that sort of wrong, it can lead to pressure and, rush decisions, etc. And then you sort of feel like, oh gosh, I'm going to have to sort of pull back from what I've already started. So having that mapped out, having that strategy is really, really important. Understanding what those costs really look like. And then moving on to that sort of operating model, I suppose trying to run a US operation entirely from the UK or vice versa, obviously, without that sort of local presence or local understanding, that's where that disconnect comes in. So making sure that you've got a full understanding of somebody sort of almost leading in that market, making sure there's a good enough strategy and execution of delivery and service, etc., is really, really important to make sure that that's completely right and you're comfortable with it, and not just sort of rushing those decisions. And then I suppose finally, it's what this is. The compliance piece is really important, because if this hasn't been looked at and sort of mapped out and well thought through, then that can cause things like penalties, delays in filing, delays in anything else. Having to unwind various decisions that have been made, having to sort of backtrack, having to pull out. So really having those, understanding what the compliance is, understanding what needs to be filed, what those complexities are in each state, and of course in the UK, is really important. So I suppose, I know I've just talked a lot, but in summary of all of those things, I'm sorry. In
Yeah.
summary of all of those things, I suppose it's sort of, the key message here is, expansion doesn't sort of fail because the opportunity isn't there. It fails because it's not right, or the detail isn't right, or it hasn't been sort of mapped out. So, don't sort of hold back because you feel that you can't do it. You can do it. It's just about making sure that strategy is right.
No, that's excellent. Kind of a real nice way to kind of summarize almost the key points from the last couple of slides. A little bit in terms of, and again, without kind of diving too much into the detail on this, but I kind of give a rundown of the types of market entry and hiring setups. And again, this is probably not one that's not probably overly specific to kind of US, UK. It can probably, relative across some other regions as well. But as you can see there, I would say to kind of highlight probably the two most popular is probably the local entity setup, which is exactly as I kind of said, register another registered company, establishing the target country, or probably say EOR, which effectively a third party legal employees that work on your behalf. And I would say again, there's a wealth there, as you can see, but they're probably the two that we probably get asked about a lot. I think a lot of business come to us and think it's just EOR. That's not the case. I think local entity and EOR tend to be the two that people go down, but one that we've definitely seen a lot of interest lately on is NRER, which is another one as well. So again, worth doing the research. I think again, we tried to kind of give a little bit of an overview in terms of who it's best for. What I would say is really try to understand what fits you best. I think people tend to dive in a little bit in terms of with EOR because it's almost kind of dipping your toe in a little bit, and it tends to be a little bit easier. Having said that, for your business, for what you need and your goals, there may be something else that's kind of there. So at least that gives you a general overview of how to enter the market and how to kind of make that first hire or kind of first set of hires.
Yeah, and that is, sorry, John, just really quickly on
Yeah.
that one. Just one of the questions I often ask clients when I'm in sort of the initial conversations with them is that sort of key question of what's their priority? Is it speed or is it control? If
Okay.
it's speed, EOR, PEO, that's the right option, as long as it works for all these other, all the other elements as well. Always a control, in which case, we go down more of that local entity route, and the other things I also ask clients is what's your need to go into that market? So what are you looking to do? You're looking just to hire somebody and test the market out, or are you driven there by one of your clients needing you to have a taxable presence, a legal entity there? So I always ask those questions. Why are you looking to expand? What's your reason for it? What's your time frame? What's your priority? And I go through all of those questions actually before we actually come to that conclusion as to what the right way to enter into that market is.
Yeah, no, I think that again, there's almost that like I say, element of soul searching yourself and having a look inwards. It's too easy to go, I want to go there and I'm just going to do it. Actually, you need to kind of look and almost like review of what kind of you want. And I think that's where, without kind of going full pitch in terms of us, is being able to answer those kind of questions that you may have, giving you the insight, but also kind of asking you the questions about to always think about yourself. So very good kind of snippets there. Little bit of a kind of case study of one of our clients who kind of we worked at in terms of some of their challenges around that incorporation, the regulatory compliance, kind of consolidating payroll and accounts, obviously looking to expand their UK operations. And that gives a little bit of an overview in terms of kind of how we've done it, what kind of steps we took with them. You were connected to this quite heavily, Emma. Any sort of kind of key points or key snippets to pick out there for the audience?
So I think just thinking about this was a US company entering into the UK, and I think what this showed is that they had faced challenges around compliance and, as John said, sort of payroll and other sort of accounting and HR setup, etc. What made the difference for them was having the right structure and support in place early. So the result of that was a sort of a smooth market entry, ability to really focus on the growth rather than operational issues. We took away all that headache from them, all of those pain points, and allowed them just to focus on their growth journey. And we took away all of that compliance as they sort of entered into the UK as their new market.
Again, without conscious obviously of time, but again, it gives a little bit of a difference in terms of from a US perspective of how they
Exactly.
did it, in terms of how they set up the entity in Texas, the difference that they have from a US entity setup, and just some of the kind of parts that you will kind of look at around what the challenges may be. On the surface, they have payroll and compliance challenges, but the solution may be kind of very different. So that just again gives a very quick overview in terms of the difference between the UK and then the difference between kind of US expansion. So as we kind of near towards the end of the kind of the webinar, so a couple of kind of questions we've had in from kind of the audience beforehand. So Emma, again, just to kind of touch on a couple of these is, the big one we often get is, how do we choose that kind of right first city, whether that's the US, whether that's the UK, and kind of does location really impact success? What would you say to that?
So, sorry, John. I was completely reading the other one of the other questions.
Yeah, so again, so from a location perspective, we always say kind of location is quite important. But is there a kind of, if I'm sat here now, I'm kind of thinking, right, I want to go to the US or I want to go to the UK and whatnot. Is how important is location, and how do I kind of go about picking that perfect kind of place to almost set up store?
Yeah. So I think, yeah, really, really, really good question, actually. And I think it's different for the UK. It's very, very different in terms of, whereabouts in the UK they set up, because generally you set up a company and it's the same the whole of England and Wales. That's down to a commercial decision as to where they want to actually either have the people or actually have a physical office. But I think in terms of the US, it's a completely different answer. So if they've identified talent and they're sitting in a particular state, they have no choice but to set up in that particular state because they are doing business there. And then they're driven by into another state because they've identified more talent. So that is such a different question to answer depending on the UK and the US. US is very much driven by compliance and where those people are actually located. UK is, you can set up a UK company under, with Companies House under England and Wales, but in terms of where they're located, it just doesn't matter. It can be anywhere.
No, I think it's good to know. I mean, it's well, kind of stating the obvious. Obviously, just the size difference is a huge one, isn't it? So, no, that's really, really good. I know you've kind of touched on kind of this before, but what's the one thing that kind of typically catches out UK companies when hiring the US, and on the flip side, what surprises US companies the most about hiring the UK?
Yeah, so I think what surprises the US companies most about hiring the UK is definitely that the people piece, the employment piece. How how structured it is, how lengthy the process is in terms of notice periods, in terms of onboarding, offboarding, and even when it comes to sort of that hiring piece as well. There's so much legislation in the UK with
Yeah.
regards to employment that it's just not as easy. So I think that always really surprises our US clients at the difficulty it is about hiring, onboarding, and offboarding employees. And I think from the other side, so what surprises UK companies about entering and hiring into the US, that is certainly with regards to that state by state compliance and how much there is to understand, state by state taxes, the different filing requirements, and then I suppose also to add to that, I mean, there's lots, isn't there? But also to add to it is the cost difference. I think that's always a surprise to our UK clients how much they are going to have to pay.
Excellent. Next question. If you had to choose one, would you, kind of, you're sat there thinking, right, I'm going to make the expansion, I'm going to do it myself, bring kind of all your years of experience to the table. Would you prioritize speed or you prioritize control in terms of when you're entering and kind of setting up?
Yeah. So it depends which hat I'm wearing. If I
Okay.
had the hat on that was wanting to go to the US and I wanted to test the market out, I wanted to see whether or not this was a viable option for me in terms of market entry, in terms of how much I could build a business there, I would 100% go with EOR, test it out, have one person, two people, see what the market's doing, see how much response you get from clients, etc. At the point that you decide that absolutely this is where I need to be, this is how I'm going to build my business, and this is absolutely the right decision to go with, you then set up that entity because it's so credible from a client's perspective if you've got your own entity there. And actually, I would answer exactly the same for businesses coming to the UK. Test it out, try the EOR route. If you're absolutely comfortable and fully back your decision that that is the right market entry, it's right for your business, then you go with that entity setup. Um, there are always going to be occasions where entity setup is the right way to go from the outset. But I think if you're putting me on the spot like that, that's probably the way I would go.
No, that's good. It's good to know. And I think the big thing with any of this is obviously, it's we're working, particularly with yourself. I mean, you're kind of drawing on, years of experience and whatnot, but it can change. It depends on what you need. I think that's a big consideration. Is it's not just I've heard someone's done this and that's what I'm going to do. It really does depend on kind of your business and you. So no, that's excellent. And then last question, visas. That tends to be one that I would say is overlooked and probably one that kind of pops up later on the line.
Yep.
However, it can be a huge stumbling block as we've found out when we've kind of jumped in and helped kind of clients and businesses at almost kind of the 11th hour a little bit. So question, can we hire locally first and sort out visas later? Would you advise that? Would you not?
So immigration is something that should be brought into the conversations and into the strategy from the absolute outset. If you're looking to hire anybody who is not a local national, immigration needs to be brought in because actually often the immigration piece is what takes the longest. So the company itself could be set up both in the UK and the US really quickly. I mean, generally sort of 4 to 6 weeks in the US, but also, and in the UK, it can be done within a couple of days. But the immigration piece, if you're hiring somebody on a visa, that sponsorship license or the equivalent of takes a good significant period of time. In the UK, it can take sort of 6 to 8 weeks. In the US, much longer. And then visas on top of that. So if they're looking to hire somebody that's a local resident or local national, then absolutely fine. You don't need to take that into consideration. But if there's any potential that you'd be looking or a client would be looking to hire somebody on a visa that's not a local national in the UK or the US, absolutely bring them in from at the beginning of those conversations.
Excellent. No, excellent. Okay, a key point there because it definitely your point in terms of it should be almost part of the planning straight from the off, not kind of an afterthought. So no, so really good kind of insights and really kind of key points there. So in terms of to kind of round up and almost kind of top tips here, and again, you're probably kind of fed up of hearing the sound of say the similar things, but I think start city first, not kind of countrywide. I think try to focus on one market before expanding further. I think that's probably more relevant for the US rather than the UK, albeit there's still the kind of side there is really try to kind of hone in and specialize and almost get your feet, get your grounds in kind of the one place rather than looking to kind of do it across multiple, because quite quickly you'll find you're either overwhelmed, you've tripped yourself up, or you will do something that, again, will probably cost you down the line, or even kind of worse off, may just kind of bring the whole kind of expansion piece, kind of falling flat on its face. Make your first hire locally relevant, in the US. If you're going to do that, prioritize, someone who can build the pipeline quickly. In the UK, prioritizing someone who understands longer sales cycles and relationship building. As we touched on earlier, the kind of sales piece, ultimately it's the main starting point for people. If you're not, if you're not winning new clients, you're not getting new business, you're not getting revenue, therefore you can't grow. So I think that sales piece is huge. And again, how that differs, and again, Emma's probably more well versed than kind of me in the conversation she has, but try to understand how that changes, the relationships that people have, how they develop, what the nuances are. And again, what I would say is you will probably find your feet a little bit with this as you go on. You'll probably make the odd hiccup a little bit, but obviously try to be as prepared as you possibly can. Choose your setup based on speed versus scale, as Emma's touched on. Enter the US, EOR can help you move quickly. Enter the UK, an entity may make more sense purely due to kind of some of the employment structure and stability. Adapt your sales motion early. US buyers expect speed, confidence, ROI-driven messaging. I think from a UK point of view, it's much more about proof, much more about case studies. I think we had again the event that we touched on last week, and there was a lady who is a kind of market expert, and one of the things that she said is a lot of buyers now, probably 80% of them, make their decision before they even get to kind of sales. So that's through content pieces, through blogs, articles, and whatnot. And that was a really kind of, again, I'd heard that before, but yeah, I was quite surprised in terms of how high that number is. So again, how that differs in the US and UK is significant, and I think that should come through in terms of your marketing strategy, your sales strategy, and your go-to-market strategy. And then the kind of the final point really is plan for real employment costs and risk. The US
Yeah.
healthcare benefits, those state taxes, which Emma's kind of touched on, it can add, a 20 to 30%, which is, it's a third almost to that figure. So it shouldn't be underestimated. Having said that, the UK, much more attractive from a cost perspective, but the compliance and some of the kind of the stricter employment laws and longer exit timelines, that is almost the kind of trade-off. So I think just worth kind of going into with that with your eyes open, and really kind of making sure. But this kind of some of the top tips and kind of key takeaways before you start your global expansion or kind of transatlantic expansion journey. So that's pretty much everything from kind of the touch on that. Emma, just to kind of round up in terms of, again, as kind of international solutions
Yeah,
kind of
of course.
director, do you just want to kind of touch on in terms of, where kind of Briars fit into this and how we can kind of help people make that dream a reality almost?
Yeah, of course. And I think the way to think about Rise is we can support with the whole back office piece. So we can help with that advisory support, how to enter into the UK, the US, the right structure to put in place. We can talk through timeframes. We'll give you a full-on process in terms of a project plan, so you can see how that looks and what needs to be done at what point. And then once that company, let's say we go with that legal entity, we can then support with that full back office compliance, so accounting, tax, payroll, HR, payments to banking, local corporate governance, really allowing you to focus on the growth of your journey. And we just take away that full compliance, all operational delivery, so that you don't need to think about any of those things. So the way to think about it is that we provide that full wraparound back office professional service support. Um, and and in some cases, it may be that actually some of that can be carried out in-house. And we often say that to our clients, John, is that, it may be that actually they want to do the accounting themselves, or they want to run the payroll themselves. That's absolutely fine, but there's always going to be an element of it that they need support, professional experts to be able to support them with. So we can talk them through, what's doable from their side and what needs to really be carried out by a professional expert in that particular area. So yeah.
That's excellent. I think again, it's what we always say is, do your research beforehand. But again, if you want to reach out to Emma, reach out to the wider team, just have a chat. Again, it's that's the big thing, is
Absolutely.
doing your research, wherever you are. Whether you're literally looking to press the button and do it tomorrow, or whether you're kind of at early stages. I think the more knowledge, the more research, and again, using someone who's been there before, done it, and kind of worn the t-shirt is key. So yeah, so kind of, to finish off there, obviously thank you everyone who obviously joined us, who kind of watched it. Hopefully you found it kind of useful, and I hope it's really kind of gave you I think also the information for you to start understanding what you need to do. And almost I think the kind of confidence, I think there's a big thing for us is, the more people, the better that do it. But again, yeah, once again, thank you very much for kind of joining myself, joining Emma. Again, hopefully we can kind of help you on your journey.
Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us.